terms of when I asked what had inspired you to write this book, you had said, in growing up in very difficult and challenging circumstances, that you had to give a damn about the things that are impacting your community. And I would imagine that that was very difficult, in part because if you are struggling just to have your basic needs met, the thought that you are supposed to invest yourself in the failings of our society, support system, lawmakers, that would seem to be a very difficult feat. What was that experience like?
It was quite difficult. I would tell you, growing up in Mississippi in poverty, can you imagine a young man going to school and coming back home and not knowing whether or not you would even have food on the table to eat? But one of the most powerful things that I was blessed with is very next door in that mobile home that I lived in, I could see the ground of the ground through that mobile home. That's how rough my conditions were in Mississippi. But I had a grandmother who lived next door to me, and my grandmother grew up. She was born in 1917, and so she lived to be 94 years old. She died the year after President Obama was inaugurated as president. But she lived through the civil rights movement. And for some reason or another, when I would go next door to my grandmother's house, even though we were in this poverty situation, she would share stories about the civil rights movement, about voting rights, about the ability to use what your God-given talents to make a difference in your community. And for some reason or another, at a very young age, I got very attracted to politics and public service work. And so I talk about in the book how I use my imagination of poverty, and I escaped by by creating a new life for myself, a life that looks like, living above poverty, a life that looks like being able to be that leader in my community. And it literally helped me. And I talk about that in my book, the power of imagination. So as a young man, using my imagination to escape my current situation. And also having my grandmother, who really was very instrumental in giving me the foundation that I need. I would never forget at the age of 16, and I talk about it in this book, where my grandmother approached me with an essay contest. And that essay contest gave you an opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. I remember I was so excited. I wrote the essay with the assistance of my grandmother. I won that essay contest at 16 years old, and it landed me a trip to Washington, D.C. 20 years later, I am an elected official in local government here in Washington, D.C. And so the power of imagination, it works, being able to see that I am not the community that I come from. I'm not poverty, but there is something great on the inside of me. And that's my hope when individuals read this book, whether young or old, that no matter what state you are in life, that there is greatness on the inside of you, and to use your mess as your ministry and use it as an opportunity to give back. And that's what I've tried to do in my life work over the course of the last 20 years of my life, after being exposed to public work and getting actively involved in my community at 16 years old.
That must have been so incredibly inspiring for many out there to see you have risen up and truly been able to use your gifts to make meaningful change. And I know for the Mississippi Free Press, you had written a piece, the founding fathers wanted a just democracy, voter suppression must end. And in it you said, it is imperative that politicians enact laws that protect and enhance voting rights in light of the ongoing threats to our democracy dressed as voter suppression and intimidation. And that is definitely something that I would like to think resonates with us all, yet so many individuals are working so hard to suppress the vote. And so there in Washington now, being a leader and having people look to you to make meaningful change, what would you say the next steps are in hopes of ending voter suppression?
I think the first step is that we pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act in the Senate. It is imperative to pass that act because we know that that act is going to ensure that there is some federal legislation and federal laws centered around some of those voting suppression that we see on the local levels and state levels across the country. So I would say number one is to definitely pass the Voting Rights Act, John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And secondly, we have to educate people about those injustices that we see in our communities as it relates to voting suppression. And so understanding that it is important that we educate people every single day about their rights, to vote and the rights when they get to the polls is very, very important. We have a lot of individuals, especially in rural communities across the country, they're not well educated on their rights. And so we have to make sure that we are funding those efforts and making sure that we are educating the people who are coming to the polls.
Yes, certainly education, and also clearing the way for those hurdles that are completely and totally unnecessary and that are trying to disenfranchise people. That is something we all should invest in, because as you've noted, people deserve the opportunity to determine their electorate, to determine the laws, to determine their own destiny. And that should have been the founding fathers' motivation in terms of creating this democracy. So in terms of your book, Those Who Give a Damn, how is the reception so far?
Very good. And let me tell you this, Adrian, I actually have another book out since we're talking about voting rights. I have a book that I just released last February during Black History Month, and it calls Vote Children Vote. And it is a preteen fictional book that talks about the importance of voting to young people. And so my Those Who Give a Damn book is doing extremely well. But I've also been on tour talking to young people. During the pandemic, I realized that we were having issues with getting the John Lewis Voting Rights Act passed in the Senate. And I said, I have been in public work since 16 years old, and I have been around the table. But I also wanted to figure out, how do I save the next generation of leaders? How do I move the needle with making sure that the next generation of leaders never forget someone like John Lewis, never forget someone like Medgar Evers? And so I wrote the second book called Vote Children Vote. And that book talks students through using a high school teacher named Miss Rosewater. And she talks to them about the importance of running for office in their own school, through a lecture of educating them about John Lewis, educating them about Medgar Evers, who died in Mississippi fighting for the right to vote. And so I dedicated that book to John Lewis. And that is one of the ways that I am also, as I'm working to legislate change in the Senate, I'm also working to make sure that the next generation of leaders never forget our history of voting and why it's important to vote. And I also believe that when we educate young people at an early age, the importance of voting, the history behind voting before they even graduate from high school, that the chances of them actually being very engaged in their civic duty is even greater. And research shows that. And so while I've been on tour with Those Who Give a Damn, who is doing extremely well, Vote Children Vote is also doing extremely well as well, because I'm in those schools talking to those young people as a way to prepare the next generation of leaders to be civically engaged in their communities.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure they very much appreciate having your mentorship and guidance. And I know that America will be all the better for it in terms of the impact you're having on those young people's minds. And so I really, really appreciate all the work that you do, and also uplifting the message in terms of fighting voter suppression and ensuring that young people fully appreciate the power that they wield as our next generation. And I want to thank you so much for joining us. If people were going to find you on social media, where can they go?
So my first and last name, Duvalier Malone, on all social media outlets, Duvalier Malone.